Okay, this will be recorded so that we can post it and share it for those who aren't able to make it in the middle of their busy days. So thank you everybody for attending. We're excited to host this webinar to get everyone prepared to participate in the upcoming externally led patient-focused drug development meeting on cerebral creatine deficiency syndromes, which will be taking place in January. So just high level, we're excited that you can all make it here. We hope that by the end of this meeting, you have a sense of why it is so important that everyone in the community is participating so that your voice is heard. The primary goal of this meeting is to hear directly from patients and caregivers about our perspectives on living with creatine deficiencies and our experiences with the treatments, whether there's a treatment available or no treatment available at all. And we hope that through this process, the outcome will be that there's an improvement in the development of new drugs in the research pipeline, and that we will inform the context in which the regulatory decisions are made about new drugs for creatine deficiencies. So thank you again for being a part of this and participating. Next slide. Thank you to our financial sponsors who have helped us with the costs of this event, Ultragenyx and Sarah's Brain Therapeutics. Thank you for your support. Next slide. So just a couple housekeeping items. Today's webinar is scheduled to last 1 hour, and all participants are in a webinar style Zoom, meaning you are muted, but please, as we discuss things and you have questions, post your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to those at the end of the meeting. And then the recording that we are making will be posted for later viewing for you to share with other members of the community, a spouse, anyone else who couldn't make it, on our website where you registered for this meeting, creatineinfo.org/EL-PFDD. Next slide. So high level, what is the purpose of this meeting? We want to educate the Food and Drug Administration and all other stakeholders on what it's like to live with CCDS. How has CCDS impacted the lives of the patients and their caregivers and their communities? And how are we currently managing creatine deficiencies? What treatments do we have available to us? And what are the struggles with those treatments? And then lastly, what would be a meaningful treatment if a treatment were developed, and what would that look like for you? Next slide. So why should we all participate? First of all, we're a rare disease, and I think that we need a full community participation in this opportunity in order for a diversity of feedback to be heard. Every voice is very important, especially in our rare disease community. The FDA approves all treatments for creatine deficiencies, and they need to know what is important to our community. And so this is a platform for us to be able to make that known. This knowledge will impact their decision-making, and it will lead to better treatments and potentially faster approvals for creatine deficiencies. If the FDA is familiar with creatine deficiencies through this meeting, they will have less research to do as they review drugs. So it's good that we're on their radar early and top of mind. So why now? Well, the patient's voice has historically been absent from drug development, and until a drug would be approved by the FDA, sometimes to treat symptoms not important to the patients, or a clinical trial was failing and the drug company or the FDA wanted input from the patients to understand the problem, that's when parents and patients were getting involved. And we want our voices heard at the beginning of the process and throughout, so that there aren't hiccups, there aren't symptoms being focused on that aren't important, and there aren't outcomes that are measured that aren't important. And then lastly, stakeholder engagement equals FDA priority. So us becoming engaged with the FDA And like I said before, having our voice heard, that just raises us up in the knowledge and awareness of the FDA. So initiated a patient-focused drug development program to learn about disease impact on patients' lives, both from patients and their caregivers. The FDA has taken the lead in changing the historical landscape of patients not heard of until the very end, and they're switching that, and they're wanting to hear from us now. So next slide. So all of this is why we're here today, and why we have invited Larry and James to help with this meeting. I want to tell you a little bit about Larry and James before I turn the time over to them. They are with Hyman, Phelps, and McNamara, and I've gotten to know them over the past several months as we've been working on planning this meeting. James has worked the last 13 years as a champion for the patient voice as part of the regulatory process. James previously worked at the FDA, where he was a patient liaison helping to incorporate the patient voice into medical product review across the FDA's various medical product centers and review divisions. There he helped to develop and launch the Patient-Focused Drug Development Initiative. And Larry worked at the NIH for 17 years in clinical research, followed by a position at the FDA as a regulatory scientist in the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research's Rare Diseases Program, a group he co-founded and worked for 10 years, where he advanced rare disease drug development. In private practice, James and Larry have worked with many other patient organizations to ensure that their community's voices were heard by decision makers. Relevant to our meeting, they have been involved in helping plan and moderating 3/4 of the over 65 externally led patient-focused drug development meetings that have happened so far. So we are in great hands with James and Larry, and thank you both for being here, and I'll turn the time over to you.
Sure. Thank you so much, Heidi. It's so great to be here. My name is James Valentine. You'll be hearing from my colleague Larry Bauer here shortly. But we're really excited to be working with this community to help plan this externally led patient-focused drug development meeting that we're as an external party helping plan and put this on, but that FDA will be participating in the meeting just like they did their original patient-focused drug development meetings. So for today, we want to share some background information that we think is going to be really valuable for all of you in this community in helping, prepare to participate in this externally led PFDD meeting, or EL-PFDD as we sometimes call it. Or if you're deciding whether or not this upcoming EL-PFDD is the right opportunity for you, you'll have a good sense of who we want to hear from, how you'll be able to participate, and we hope by the end of it you'll feel encouraged to participate. So the information we're going to cover today is going to cover some of the background on FDA and drug development, so you know a little bit about the ecosystem that we're operating in. But then secondly, we'll tell you about where your voices as caregivers fit into that regulatory and drug development framework. We'll talk a little bit specifically about how the EL-PFDD meeting is going to provide opportunities and how it's designed to bring forward important experiences and preferences from all of you and others that will participate. And finally, we'll get kind of really down into the details so you know exactly how the meeting's organized, some of the logistics, some tips for participation. So we have a lot of ground to cover today, but we will be saving time for Q&A with all of you. So please do submit your questions as we go, and we'll take a break at the end and answer the questions that you have. So I'm going to get us started talking about giving some background on FDA and drug development. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk us through each of the kind of general steps of how drugs are developed first, as a way to kind of see the different opportunities for considering what is important to patients. So if we think about the steps of drug development, it really isn't starting with clinical trials. It's not even really starting with some of the animal studies and other non-clinical research. The first thing that we're doing is trying to actually discover drugs. And this is why basic science research, the type of research that's done at NIH and academic institutions, is so important, because it helps us in understanding the disease process. And that gives us insights into where maybe a product could help stop or maybe even reverse the effects of a disease. And so when we understand this disease process, we can think about some of the different opportunities to intervene and what maybe different compounds or treatment approaches could intervene in that disease process, whether that's to treat the overall disease or maybe targeted single symptoms or aspects of the condition. Sometimes existing treatments can be these types of compounds. So a lot of the times, as you all may know, treatments are used off-label, or drug developers and researchers may discover unanticipated effects of drugs that maybe originally were designed for one disease and can be used in another. But other times we're looking at new technologies, particularly in the era of more targeted and personalized medicine, and our better understanding of the genetic causes of diseases. We can, both in terms of traditional drugs, as well as things like gene therapies, target some of those, true underlying causes of the disease. So regardless of what type of technology, or if it's a drug that's totally novel or has been used before, once we understand and identify that promising compound, then we can move into really the development stages, for the product and understand really if it's safe and effective. And so here you'll see those development stages across the chevron in the bottom of the slide, and we'll be moving through those. We're just going to be presenting this at a high level. This may be kind of a refresher or for some of you, but we want to make sure everyone has the same foundation in this process of drug development. So the first step is in development is preclinical development, and that means exactly what it sounds like, which is before we go into the clinic, which means before we test the drug in humans. And so before we take a drug and test it in humans, and people both could be healthy volunteers as well as people living with the specific condition, we really want to first understand, is it reasonably safe for initial use in humans? And not only is it reasonably safe, but if we have models of the disease, whether an animal model or maybe a chemical assay test, do we see that the drug is having the types of effects in animals that we would hope it would have in people that are actually living with a disease or condition? And so these two types of tests, the safety tests, are called toxicology studies. The preliminary efficacy called pharmacology studies. And so this makes up our non-clinical or our preclinical development stage. And once we finish doing this type of preclinical work, we then are able to apply to FDA through what's called an investigational new drug application, or an IND, to be able to propose and go into clinical or human testing. That first stage of clinical development is called phase 1. So we'll refer to a clinical trial that's part of this phase as a phase 1 clinical trial or study. And in order to go into clinical development, as I mentioned, you have to submit an application called an IND, which is made up of those pharmacology and toxicology studies, but it also includes other important information. A third prong, in addition to safety and effectiveness that FDA is always looking at, is also drug quality. And this is important. We don't often talk about it or think about it because it's almost somewhat assumed. But we want to make sure that when drugs are produced and given to people, whether in trials or once they're approved, that the drug is actually consists of what it's expected to be. You're going to get the right amount of the active ingredient. You don't want to be underdosed or overdosed. We want to make sure that there's not impurities that might be harmful. And so there's a whole set of manufacturing information that's collected over time, just like safety and effectiveness information, to show that the drug is being produced in a high quality way. So that is submitted to FDA, as well as the proposed clinical trial design, which is presented in the study plan, which is called a protocol, as well as with other information like investigator information. Investigators are the doctors that run clinical trials. as well as things like informed consent forms that, our study participants will be, using to become informed and make decisions of whether to participate. So all of that is provided to FDA. FDA has 30 days to review that information. And if they tell the company or whoever is developing the drug that they may proceed, well, then we can go and start our clinical trials. And typically we're starting with phase 1, a phase 1 clinical trial. It's fairly small and fairly short. In fact, some phase 1 programs, a lot of phase 1 programs start with just a single dose to make sure that a single dose of a drug is safe when given to people. And then we move into multiple doses, and then we test multiple dose levels. So we start from a smaller dose and we work our way up. And so this allows us to understand the drug's safety. Because we're not giving this to a lot of people and we're not giving it for very long, we're only going to be able to identify the most common side effects. There may be rarer side effects that we'll only discover later in drug development, but we at least want to know how significant and how severe are those most common side effects, because no drug, is truly, 100% safe. All drugs come with some side effects profiles. In phase 1, at the same time, while these studies aren't long enough to really evaluate whether a drug is showing treatment benefit, we can at least see where the drug gets to in the body, how long it sticks around, depending on what the drug's intended to do. Is it getting to the right target organs and tissues within the body? And maybe we can even look at some initial early markers, of the drug's treatment effect. But we're not really evaluating whether this is, helping patients in terms of something that a patient would really experience and be able to tell themselves. So if we have, sufficient safety, we can identify a dose of the drug that is reasonably safe, that is also having the activity and getting to where it needs to go, for long enough to have the desired effect. Then we can go into what's called phase 2. So phase 2 is the middle phase of doing clinical trials. And so these studies, we begin now to introduce the ability to assess a drug's effectiveness. And so when we assess a drug's effectiveness, we're trying to understand, how the drug helps a person living with a condition in terms of how they feel, how they function, or how they survive. Those are the primary ways we're looking at assessing a drug's effectiveness, unless we're looking at a surrogate biomarker that's been shown to predict one of those 3 things. And so here we can look, we're starting to see, if it works in people. So these studies are always done in actual patients. We're not, phase 1 can be done in healthy volunteers or in patients. Here, this is done in patients because we want to see if the drug actually is having the desired treatment effect. Because we're looking at the drug's effectiveness, and these studies are a little bit bigger and longer, we'll introduce control groups, most often placebo control groups, to allow us to assess the drug's effect relative to no treatment. And we've all heard of the placebo effect. So it allows us to really identify what the drug is giving in terms of benefits as well as risks, compared to a placebo effect, or there's a phenomenon where people that are in trials tend to get better care than they might get just in regular healthcare settings. So maybe even those in the placebo group get a little boost because they're in a clinical trial where they're being monitored more closely and getting maybe more careful care. These studies, may be a matter of, a few months. It all depends on what the outcomes are that we're assessing. But we'll be able to now start to pick up on some of those side effects that might appear only after longer dosing. Or as we start to increase the size, maybe we'll pick up on some of those more rare side effects as well. So a lot of times we think of phase 2 as kind of our proof of concept studies, because we're showing before we invest in a big phase 3 study and ask people to participate in a longer study. We want to have some, information to let us know that the drug actually is working in patients. And so we have some reason to to believe and hypothesize for a phase 3 trial that it will, ultimately be effective. We may in phase 2 still be evaluating different dose levels. So that way we can help pick which one or maybe 2 doses we'll take into phase 3. So phase 3, these are sometimes what are referred to as like a pivotal trial or a registration trial. You read, kind of press releases from companies, sometimes they'll use those terms. But phase 3, these are our largest scale studies. They're the ones that are most likely to be randomized, placebo-controlled trials. And that's because these are our studies that really demonstrate the drug's effectiveness. They have enough people and they're long enough to really be able to test whether or not the drug is truly improving patients' lives in a meaningful way, versus just giving us kind of an early read on that. We also, because these are longer studies, sometimes phase 3 studies, for chronic conditions can be 6 months, 1 year, maybe even 2 years, depending on the type of treatment. And so we can really see the duration of the effect. So not just what the initial effect is, but what happens. Is there a plateau, or do people continue to, benefit more and more over time? Because these studies are larger, we can actually look at different subpopulations, men versus women, different age groups, maybe people with different levels of severity or different symptoms at baseline when they started in the study. We can see, does the drug have the same effect from one subpopulation to the next? And again, we may be also still evaluating varying doses of the drug. Importantly, even though these phase 3 trials are where we're really establishing drug effectiveness, we're always looking at drug safety. And so that's going to continue. Same thing with safety. The longer you're on the drug, does that create new safety events? And are there even more rare safety events that are being uncovered? But also, by phase 3, we're able to, as we're broadening, and generally phase 3 studies a little bit broader of inclusion-exclusion criteria, we're going to be including patients that maybe are on standard of care therapies, so we can make sure there's no drug-drug interactions before these drugs are approved. So when we finish phase 3, and phase 3 may be one study in rare diseases, and so they often are, but not always. Kind of the default position is that you need 2 studies, one to show the effect and the second to confirm it. But in rare diseases, because of the small numbers of patients that are available, as well as some of the urgency and seriousness of the unmet need, a lot of the times FDA allows those, and this is something that's allowed under the law for FDA to approve based off of a single phase 3 study. And so once all of this information is collected, the drug developer, most often a company, will meet with FDA in what's called a pre-new drug application, or NDA, or pre-biologics license application, or BLA meeting. An NDA is just an application for a traditional drug. A BLA is an application for a biological product, for example, an enzyme replacement therapy, maybe a therapeutic vaccine or a cell or gene therapy. Those are all different types of biological products. The standards are pretty much the same. There's some slight nuance between the two, but for our purposes, you can think of them as pretty much equivalent. So companies will go in and meet with FDA. They're going to say, here's what our pivotal studies were. Here's the top line data. Here's how we chose to analyze it, because this stage, they're just presenting the results. They're not giving FDA all the data. That will come later. And their whole goal of this meeting is to uncover major issues that may preclude the drug from being able to be approved, in hopes that maybe that can be done, or any additional work can be completed before an NDA or BLA comes to FDA. Because once that happens, FDA begins doing a full review, and that takes many months. And so you don't want FDA, if they knew of an issue before, waiting to tell a company later down that road. So the NDA or the BLA itself is going to include all of the animal and human data. So everything from that preclinical phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, all of it gets packaged together. And there's summaries as well as the underlying data sets. So something that's unique in the United States is FDA actually does its own analyses using the data. It doesn't just rely on those that are presented by the applicant. So all of that is packaged and given to FDA, so that way FDA can do its review. The first thing FDA does when it's reviewing is determine whether that application is complete. Is something missing, or is something so the information that's provided is so deficient that FDA knows that it won't be able to approve based off of the type and quality of information provided, in which the case they can refuse to file the application. But assuming they file the application, then FDA really rolls up its sleeves and they assign a review team, and they begin to assess whether the effectiveness of the drug's been demonstrated. They want to know, they evaluate what the safety profile is. And ultimately, we'll talk about this a little later, whether the benefits outweigh the risks. And it's not that the drug has to be completely safe, because no drug is completely safe. And as I mentioned, when we were talking about the IND, we're also going to submit all of the manufacturing information. And as drug development goes on and we get closer to an approval, companies are scaling up their manufacturing because they need to produce a lot more than they needed just to supply clinical trials. Now they're going to have to be ready to supply, the entire market, all the people that might be prescribed the drug. And so that scale up requires some changes in how the drug gets manufactured. And they want to make sure when they make those changes, it keeps the drug high quality. When FDA is reviewing, they can choose to either conduct the review completely on their own, or they can take the review and ask questions of what's called an advisory committee. So advisory committees are panels of external experts, clinicians, statisticians, also patients and consumer representatives are on these committees that meet, and FDA will provide them, and the applicant will provide them with background information, and FDA will ask them questions, including usually some type of question about essentially the approvability of the product. And these committees will vote, and ultimately those votes are advisory though. So FDA doesn't have to agree with the committee. They can make a different decision than how the committee votes. Ultimately, it's still FDA's determination of whether to approve the drug or not. Assuming a drug does get approved, FDA's role doesn't stop there, and the drug companies' roles don't stop there. They continue to primarily monitor the safety of the drug. The number of people that are in clinical trials is a lot smaller than usually the number of people that take the product when it's out on the market. So again, you're going to get some of those really rare maybe events that we didn't have enough people in the clinical trials to pick up on. But we're also going to be taking the product to a more real world population. So those people who maybe were excluded from clinical trials, now are going to be able to take the product. And so we're going to learn how, the product and how safe it is in that wider range of people. And so that's why it's important to stay on top of this and make sure that the benefits of the drug continue to outweigh the risks as we learn more about what the risks are. So we've talked a lot about drug development and how drugs actually are studied and reviewed. But I want to just spend a couple minutes, since this meeting that we're having, this external led PFDD, one of the main audiences we're speaking to is the FDA. I want you to know exactly what FDA's role is in all of that. So some of this is what FDA doesn't do. So we talked about how drugs are studied in clinical trials, and that's how drugs get developed. Well, FDA is not actually doing the development of drugs. That's researchers, pharmaceutical companies, even sometimes nonprofit groups are funding or doing this type of work directly. So FDA doesn't get to pick which drugs get developed. It's up to external parties to pick which drugs get developed and to pursue that development. Similarly, as drugs are being developed, FDA is not the one that's testing those drugs. So FDA is not running trials. They're not on site when trials are being conducted. Instead, researchers that are conducting trials do have to submit their research protocols to FDA, and FDA reviews those. But ultimately, companies have a lot of discretion on what studies that they want to conduct in order to support their development program. Kind of beyond just thinking about the drug studies themselves, there's some things that are important to know about FDA's regulatory kind of scope and authority. So FDA doesn't have authority to regulate the practice of medicine. FDA regulates how drugs get studied, and once drugs are approved, how companies can market those products in terms of like what they can say the benefits and risks are. But doctors, for example, are free to prescribe FDA-approved drugs for other conditions. And as we mentioned before, this is known as off-label use. So FDA doesn't actually regulate the practice of medicine. They can't tell doctors that they can or can't use something off-label. Similarly, FDA does not regulate the price of medicine. So FDA doesn't consider how much a drug will cost once it's approved. In fact, even if it had that information, it couldn't use it because that's not part of its legal framework. But FDA doesn't have that information. And so as we think about talking to FDA and sharing our experiences, we're not really focused on issues with the healthcare system or with access and affordability. I talked a lot about what FDA doesn't do. It doesn't mean FDA doesn't play a big role. They do. They play a big role in facilitating drug development, and it's actually part of their core mission, which is not just to protect the public health as a gatekeeper, but to help promote the public health. And so FDA reviewers, these are people who see the data and the study designs for every drug that gets studied, not just those that are successful, but even those that fail. And so, they know a lot of best practices and they have a lot of technical expertise that they can provide to the companies and researchers. And so FDA does provide that technical help. In fact, all throughout those stages of development, companies are coming back and they're having meetings and making submissions. And FDA helps those companies design their trials to have that best chance to really, determine whether or not a drug is safe and effective. Because there's, even if a drug isn't effective, we'd rather know that it's not effective. The study wasn't successful because the drug truly isn't effective, rather than be scratching our heads and saying, was it because that was a bad study design, or is it because the drug didn't work? And so there are all of these interactions, and so FDA does play a big role, and that's why we want FDA to hear from all of you, so they can really be patient-centered in their thinking as they give advice to companies. We covered all of this information about FDA's roles in drug development at a high level. If you want some more information, FDA has some resources for patient stakeholders, which you can find on the FDA website listed here. But now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about how your voice, the patient and caregiver voice, fits into that framework. I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Larry Bauer, to walk us through that.
Thank you so much, James, for that great overview of the Food and Drug Administration and how they approve drugs. Like James said, now we're going to get into a little bit of the nitty-gritty for this specific meeting that's for creatine deficiency syndromes. Next slide. So what's the purpose of this meeting? The FDA had wanted a more systematic way to gather perspectives from patients and caregivers about their condition and about the treatment options that were available. This kind of information can help the FDA in their understanding of the context of benefits and risks when they're looking at a new drug and when they're trying to make decisions about whether or not to approve a new drug. And patient input, it really helps the FDA during drug development. So in the early stages, as well as at the end of the line when they're reviewing all of the data for a clinical study. Next. So I mentioned in the last slide about benefit risk. So, James had said when he was talking about what the FDA does, one of the big things is that they review clinical research studies, and then they are the ones who make the final decision, should this drug be made available at pharmacies and for your pharmacist and doctor to be able to provide the drug for people living with a certain condition. So the way they do it in a very systematic way. They need to analyze what is the condition. So they want to understand what is this disease, what are the symptoms of the disease, how do those symptoms impact people's lives, and then they also want to know what are the current treatment options. So what's available if you're a person living with this condition? What drugs are available for you to take? Are there already FDA-approved treatments, or is this a condition without any FDA-approved treatment? And maybe any prescription drug that's prescribed for a person with that disease is done off-label, which means It's not in the label, it was never studied for that disease. Those are the kinds of things that they want to learn from patients and families. The other part of their equation is really analyzing the benefits and risks of a new drug. And that information comes from the clinical data from the clinical trial. So when someone participates in a clinical trial, a lot of data is collected at the baseline, then they're given a new treatment. And then after a certain amount of time, it's evaluated whether there's been any change in the condition. They also, through that process, are evaluating what are the side effects that might occur in people receiving this experimental treatment. How serious are those side effects? Were they serious enough that someone had to stop taking the experimental drug? And if there is a side effect that comes up, maybe it comes up a lot, is there a way that you can manage it? For instance, if people get nausea and vomiting as a side effect of the treatment, are there drugs that they can treat that or lessen it? So maybe that's not so significant when they're considering what are the benefits and the risks. And so at the end of the day, the FDA is trying to balance this balancing act. Do the benefits of this new drug outweigh the potential risks of it? And then they make their decision. Next slide. So our externally led patient-focused drug development meeting, it was based on these patient-focused drug development meetings that the FDA did. They did about 24 meetings as an experiment where they met with patients that had a certain disease. They asked them a lot of questions. They listened and learned. After doing 24 meetings, they realized this is a great way to get data from patients and caregivers, but they realized they could no longer do this for all the diseases that exist. So they turned it over to patient advocacy organizations. And that's why it's called an externally led patient-focused drug development meeting. It's external to the FDA. The FDA has been supporting us as we put together this meeting, but it's really being run by the Creatine Deficiencies Association. So we've put together we've reviewed, the disease, we've put together some questions, and we have an agenda for this meeting and panel questions that we think will help communicate the most important information related to CCDS. And the FDA, as we've been planning, has emphasized active patient involvement and participation is the key to the success of this meeting that we're planning. Next slide. At the end of the day, once the meeting is finished, we will have a medical writer that is attending and taking notes throughout the day. The medical writer will put together a report called the Voice of the Patient Report. This is a summary of the meeting. It will contain what we heard from patients and caregivers and audience testimony, as well as the polling data. We'll do some live polling at the meeting, and all of your submitted written comments. We will try to analyze all of this for themes that emerged and some of the key points that we heard throughout the day. This document, this Voice of the Patient report, is a key communication document to the FDA review staff, as well as to drug developers that might be interested in developing a new treatment for creatine deficiencies. And it will teach them about what is most important in a new treatment for patients and caregivers. And FDA wants this information because it informs them about the different ways that new treatments for CDS can be developed. Next slide. So now how do you participate in the meeting? So, okay, who is the meeting for? As I mentioned earlier, it's a public meeting, so anyone can attend. You can invite family and friends, a doctor, a colleague, and anyone can attend at all. It's especially for people living with CDS, with CCDS, with patients, as well as their caregivers. We are inviting FDA staff to attend and hope as many as possible attend. We also will have participants from the pharma and biotech companies and anyone interested in learning more. The meeting will take place on January 23rd, so it's coming up in just about, 7-8 weeks. It'll start at 10 a.m. and end at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. It's a virtual meeting. so people can attend from all over the United States as well as from Europe and other parts of the world. And it will be an interactive live stream. And here is the URL where you can go to register for the meeting.
I'm going to interrupt you on that slide.
Yeah, go ahead.
No one gets confused. It's the 24th of January.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, shoot. That's, yeah, sorry. We have a rehearsal on the 23rd. Yeah. Okay. Sorry about that. Next slide. So what will the agenda look like on the day of the meeting? We will have welcome and introductory remarks from the Association for Creatine Deficiencies, as well as from a representative from the FDA. Then we'll get a clinical background on CCDS by a CCDS expert. And then the rest of the day will be broken into two main topics. The main topic for the morning will be how do CCDS symptoms affect your lives and what are the impacts on your lives. And then we'll take a break for lunch for a half hour. We'll come back in the afternoon and shift gears a little bit. And the focus in the afternoon will be how do you manage symptoms and current and future approaches to treatment. The topics will include pre-recorded patient panels. We have 5 people, 5 panelists for each session. It'll include polling questions and a moderated discussion with the audience, who is you. And then we'll close out the day with a summary of the meeting and some closing remarks. Next slide. So what are some of the questions that we're going to talk about on the day of the meeting? For this topic 1, we're going to ask you, like, of all the symptoms of CCDS, which 1 to 3 symptoms have the most significant impact on you or your loved one's life? How does CCDS affect you on best and on worst days? Describe your best and worst days. We want to know if there's specific activities that are important to you that you or your loved one cannot do at all or as fully as you would like because of CCDS. Next slide. We want to know how have your symptoms changed over time. So since the time of diagnosis, has there been progression? Has it been the same? And how has your ability to cope with the symptoms changed over time? What do you fear the most as you or your loved one gets older? What worries you the most about your condition, and what frustrates you the most about your condition? Next. And then, as I said, we'll shift gears in the afternoon, kind of focused more on treatments. Some of the questions in the afternoon session will be, what are you currently doing to manage CCDS symptoms? How well do these treatments treat the most significant symptoms of your CCDS? What are some of the significant downsides to your current treatments, and how do they affect your life? And we know that's going to be an important discussion for your community. And short of a complete cure, what specific things would you look for in an ideal treatment for CCDS? So if something new was going to be developed, what would that new treatment look like for you? And what would the benefits that you'd want to see in that treatment? Next slide. So like I said, we'll have a panel of patients for each topic. The purpose for these panelists is to set a foundation for the broader audience discussion that'll follow. The panelists were selected to reflect a range of experiences with the condition, as well as the variety of subtypes within CCDS. We'll also do polling questions. This takes place using your telephone, and we'll give you instructions on the day of the meeting how to participate. We hope many of you participate in the polling. And then we'll move to a moderated discussion with people in the audience. And the purpose of this is to build on the experiences that we'll hear from the panelists, and the moderator, who's going to be me, will ask questions and invite you to submit responses in writing, but preferably we'd like you to call in to provide live comments. And there'll be a phone number at the top of your screen on the day of the meeting that gives you instruction, how to call in. Next. So a couple tips for effective participation. We want you to remember FDA's role and the purpose of the meeting. So that's going back to what James had shared with us. Maybe review these discussion questions in advance so you have some ideas or thoughts about what you'd like to share. And if you have something important to share, relate it to the most appropriate topic or panel question that we're discussing live during the meeting, and then pick up the phone and call in to speak with us. It's okay to reiterate a feeling or experience that's been voiced by someone else, but if you're going to share it, try to put a spin or give it a flavor that really is your unique perspective. And we ask that you try to keep your comments concise and focused, because we want to hear from as many people as possible from the audience. And know that you can always send in additional comments after the meeting. Next slide. So to participate in the discussion, as I said, it's going to be webcast. That you'll have the opportunity to participate in the polling, to call in or write in. You can register right now at this website, www.creatineinfo.org/EL-PFDD. Comments with answers to the questions may be submitted prior to the meeting now. So, you know, when you register, you can already start sending some written comments in, or for up to 30 days after the meeting. And we will try to include as many of these comments as possible in the Voice of the Patient report that we submit to the FDA. Next. So in summary, this is your opportunity to be part of the process. We're so glad to see all of you that you've taken the time today to listen to this webinar. Please know that you can have a meaningful impact on clinical trial design and development for people living with CCDS. Your collective voices must be heard at the beginning of the process of drug development to help companies, drug companies, to design trials that better meet your needs, and to help the FDA assess the risks and benefits with a full understanding of the impact of CCDS and the patient and caregiver perspective. So we really hope that you'll attend and help us to make a difference. This is such a unique opportunity that we have to spend this time with the FDA and all the people that will be listening. So we thank you. We have a few minutes left now. At the end, we would like you to please consider sending in any questions. There's a QA box at the bottom of your screen. If you want to type in a question, all questions are fair. You know, we threw a lot of information at you. So anything that comes to mind about this meeting or how to participate or what's important to talk about, we would be happy to share with you. And I'm going to invite Heidi and James to come back and join me to look at these questions. Heidi?
All right. Well, we'll just take the difficult one to answer first. Someone has asked, is there anything potentially studied for CTD? In how many years do you think something will be available? So I can take a stab at the first part of that question. You know, I think James highlighted that everything starts with research. And so if you are following along with the research progress of ACD, you'll know that we have 4 fellowships we funded this year. We have new fellowship applications. And we'll be awarding new fellow awards for next year. And so we're certainly, as a patient community, we're all raising funds and awarding funds to encourage those researchers who have interest in learning more about the biology of CTD and finding those potential ways of addressing the disorder. But we also do have 2 companies which, you know, are featured as our sponsors of this meeting, who have shared publicly that they're investigating treatments as well. And so the timeline on all of that, I'll let James comment or Larry on how long this process usually takes once there's an application made, but I'm unqualified there.
Yeah, unfortunately, there's no easy answer to the question because, you know, drug development takes many years, and you know, it can be highly variable if we're talking about something that is one of those drugs that's maybe already been approved and this is a new indication for it. It might be much shorter versus if we're using a truly novel technology that maybe not only, you know, is the particular product new, but maybe the overall technology itself, like a cellular gene therapy, is relatively novel and new. You know, there's going to be, you know, the length and type and number of studies can be very different. But that being said, you know, I think, you know, from the time that, you know, it usually takes, you know, at least a year, usually a few years to do that non-clinical development work. So it's not just there's one set of studies, there's some preliminary studies that happen, and then that enables your kind of kind of pivotal non-clinical studies that are actually going to be what stands up and allows you to submit that investigational new drug application to FDA. In terms of clinical trials, I talked about it in terms of phase 1 separate from phase 2 and then phase 3. A lot of the time that those in rare diseases, some of those can be consolidated. So sometimes you might have phase 1/2 studies or phase 2/3 studies. And in some arenas, FDA is even open to a phase 1/2/3. So depending on how those studies go, how clear the evidence is, that will determine what additional studies are needed. Same even if you need 1 versus 2 phase 3 kind of pivotal studies, a lot of that will depend on how strong of a result is shown in the first. Doesn't mean just because it's maybe not as eye-popping from the first study that a drug can never get approved. It's just that we might be concerned that there's some possibility that it was due to chance, and we want to confirm that result in another study. So once something reaches the clinic, it's going to take 8 or more years usually before something would get to the point of having a new drug application submitted. And once something is submitted to FDA for review, that review timeline is usually between 8 to 12 months, because FDA has 2 months to do that initial review to make sure that the application is complete. And then they have either 6 months for a priority review or 10 months for a standard review to determine whether or not to approve the drug. So, most of the time of drug development is spent actually doing clinical trials, not during FDA review time. But it is a number of years that have to get invested into this. But there's always exceptions. We can always find those situations where there was just one study that knocked it out of the park, and the company decided to not do staged, but they were able to combine things into a single study to answer a lot of different questions. So if you talk to other rare disease communities, there are going to be those examples where something was done more rapidly than what I just described. But even in rare diseases, what I described is more of what the expectation should be. I hope that helps.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question. One of the things that we did not mention really clearly is that within CCDS, we have 3 main subtypes: the AGAT, GAMT, and CTD. And when people call in, we're going to ask you on the day to maybe say your first name, or you can even make up a name if you want to be anonymous, where you're from, and then what subtype you have. And when we do the analysis in the voice of the patient report, we're going to analyze what we heard by subtype. And so for people with CTD, where I know treatments are very, like non-existent, we want to hear from you, because one of the things we want to teach the FDA is the incredible unmet medical needs that continue in your community. So even if there's not a treatment, talk about, is there anything you use to treat certain symptoms of CTD? Is there anything that helps? If it's really ineffective, we want to hear that it's ineffective. This is, during this meeting, we want to kind of draw back the curtain and talk about some things that maybe you don't like to usually think about or talk about with other people. We want to educate the FDA on what's it really like to live with these conditions. So thank you for asking about that.
You brought up a good point, and I would also point out that the recorded statements that we're including are from a diverse background of the subtypes, including each of the 3, including females with CTD as well as males. So there will be diversity baked in as well. Yeah.
And the more of you that we hear from, the more that we'll get a better understanding of each of these subtypes. That's why we're having this webinar today, to try to get you interested and excited and to help us spread the word.
Okay. So next question is, understanding the FDA doesn't regulate medical practice. In general, do newly FDA approved drugs get placed on insurance companies and or Medicare approved drug lists?
Yeah, so this is a little bit outside of our area because we are so FDA focused. But, so one thing just to point out is not only does FDA not regulate the practice of medicine, so what doctors and other healthcare professionals do, they also don't have any influence over payers, insurance companies and what is covered. So just because something becomes FDA approved, there's another then decision making that happens after that, to determine insurance coverage. And in the United States, we're in a system where it's very fragmented. So not only, there's many different private insurers, they're all making their own individual decisions. You have Medicare and Medicaid, government payers, as well as, things like, military insurance and, other types of government insurance, and they're all individually making these kinds of determinations. And so they're looking to take what FDA, is in the FDA approved labeling, but also, other information that might exist. They're not limited to looking just at what FDA, made their decision on. They can look at a broader set of information to make their coverage decisions. Typically, drug developers, they're not going to be developing drugs that they don't believe could be, would get covered by insurance. And obviously they're going to negotiate their prices and everything like that in order to get insurance coverage. So there's not, again, it's one of those areas that I couldn't give you what percentage in general. I would say that's probably pretty high because it wouldn't make sense to spend all of this time and huge, millions and millions of dollars developing drugs, if they ultimately in general, didn't get covered by insurance.
Okay, last question. What's a good or great turnout for an EL-PFDD meeting, such as 100 attendees or more or less? I'm guessing this will really vary depending on the disease. So let's say for a rare disease.
Yeah, that's the thing. Even within the world of rarity, we have diseases where we've got 7,500 people identified, in the world with a rare disease versus some that have a couple thousand. If we can get anywhere between 60 to 200, that's a very broad range. I think that's a wonderful turnout. That means that we've got good representation, that we've heard from a variety of people. And that was a big goal for the FDA. They used to talk to individuals with the disease, but they realized that when you talk to an individual, you're just getting one perspective. And, James and I have done so many of these meetings, and we realized that it's like painting a picture from many different sides to get a really full understanding. And it's usually incredibly successful. So
I'll just say if it was 200, that would be great for a rare disease.
yeah.
I would say, we've had extremely engaged, and high quality meetings when we've had between like 70 to 100 people turning out, then you're going to add on a lot of times to that, with a number of people from FDA and industry and researchers, so I'd say good, really good would be, in that like at least 70 people mark. If we hit 200, that for a rare disease would be probably pretty incredible.
Right.
All right, that's great. I think we just set ourselves a goal.
Spread the word.
Yep. Okay, I have one very quick question for the families in the community that have more than one child affected by a creatine deficiency. When they participate in the EL-PFDD through polling, how would you recommend they answer those questions, especially if their kids have a different manifestation of the disease?
Yeah, so we'll be asking that for purposes of polling that you pick one experience and answer that, for that individual throughout. So the best thing that we can suggest is in that scenario, if you can have, another caregiver, it could be another, it doesn't even have to be, primary caregiver. In fact, for the meeting in general, we love to hear from close family friends, grandparents, siblings, because every different perspective helps us understand that full picture of the impacts of the condition. And so in terms of polling, which is just one type of participating, we will ask that you maybe divide and conquer, but when you call in, you can share about both, and maybe even compare and contrast a little bit, or if you write in with comments. So it's only polling that will ask that you focus in on just one of those individuals' experiences.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, James and Larry, for helping us with this meeting today and sharing all of your wealth of knowledge and experience. And I do really feel like we're in good hands with your guidance and support. And I just want to remind the community of a couple of upcoming very important things. If you are not yet registered for the EL-PFDD on January 24th, please do so on the same page on our website as you signed up for this. And also be on the lookout for materials for the Delphi survey. This is the core outcome set development that we are working on through our PCORI project that was first launched with our focus group at the symposium in the summer, and will go on to all community members, caregivers, and clinicians around the world, as many as possible, so that we can collaborate and create a core outcome set that is meaningful to the patients with GAMT and CTD. And if we have your email address, you will receive an invite. If you want your clinician invited, which we very much do want to invite your clinician, you can submit their information by registering for the expert panel. That's creatineinfo.org/expert-panel. And if you can provide their email address there, they'll be sure to be invited for the Delphi survey. And if you are registered for the expert panel, you'll be invited to all of those in the series. They occur every 3 months. The next expert panel is February 1st. So look for that invite. And I think that is it. Thank you again, Larry and James, very, very much, and everyone who attended.
Okay.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, Heidi. Yep.
Bye.
Bye-bye.